Simon had never noticed how loud New York could be until the night he realized he couldn't hear himself anymore. Not his thoughts, not his heartbeat, just the endless hum of the city swallowing him whole. He sat on the steps outside his apartment in the East Village, hoodie pulled over his head, half-empty coffee beside him. Around him, people rushed, headlights flashed, a couple laughed across the street. It was a Friday night, but it all blurred into the same restless rhythm. For months, Simon had been drifting through that rhythm. Wake up, run, design, post, repeat. His life as a freelance graphic designer was supposed to be his dream, but lately it just felt like noise. He looked up when he heard someone humming. Not the kind of humming that tries to fill silence, but the kind that seems to belong to it. The voice came from across the street, where a guy was locking up a small corner flower shop. The sign read Adrian's Blooms. The guy, tall, tan skin catching the streetlight, hair pushed back carelessly, was carrying a crate of withered tulips and humming what sounded like an old Sam Cooke song. It was completely out of place in the chaos of the city, and maybe that was why Simon couldn't stop watching. When Adrian looked up, their eyes met. Just a glance, a few seconds too long to be accidental, before Adrian smiled, soft and knowing. It wasn't flirtatious. It was the kind of smile that said, "I see you." That was the first time Simon felt silence again. A week later, Simon walked into the flower shop. He told himself it was to buy something for his desk. He stood there awkwardly, pretending to look at plants until Adrian emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. "Hey," Adrian said, his voice calm like slow water. "You look like a tulip guy." Simon blinked. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Adrian laughed. "Definitely. They're resilient, but they don't like too much chaos. They need rest between blooms." Simon smiled for the first time in days. "Rest isn't exactly this city's specialty. Then maybe you just need someone to remind you how." That was how it began. Over the next few weeks, Simon kept finding reasons to stop by. A new plant, a different bouquet, sometimes just a few words exchanged before he'd walk out into the crowded streets, feeling like the noise didn't press so hard anymore. Adrian never asked for anything, he just was calm, patient, the kind of person who didn't rush even when time demanded it. One evening, Simon came in soaked from the rain. Adrian didn't say a word. He just handed him a towel, motioned toward the counter, and made 2 cups of chamomile tea. They sat in the dim light surrounded by petals and soil and the smell of green things. Simon watched the steam rise between them. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly. "Stay still in all this madness." Adrian sipped his tea, eyes fixed on Simon. "I used to run from it too, until I realized peace isn't a place. It's a choice. Sometimes it just takes someone else to show you where to start." There was something in his tone, something that made Simon want to ask who helped you, but instead, he just nodded, staring at the lines of Adrian's hands as they wrapped around the mug. They looked steady, safe. It was that night, standing in the rain outside the shop, that Simon realized he wasn't lonely anymore. He started spending more evenings there, helping Adrian close up, rearranging flowers, listening to music while the city roared outside. Sometimes they talked about dreams, Simon's fear of fading into insignificance, Adrian's story about leaving a job on Wall Street to open the shop after his father's death. Other nights, they didn't talk at all. They just existed. 2 quiet souls in a city built on noise. One night in late summer, Adrian took Simon up to the rooftop of the building where he lived. The city glowed beneath them. Golden windows, distant sirens. Laughter carried through the warm air. Adrian handed him a small pot of lavender. "For you," he said. "It helps you breathe when the world doesn't." Simon traced a finger over the fragile petals. "You always know what to say." Adrian smiled. "Maybe because I stopped trying to fix the world. Now I just grow things that make it a little softer." They stood in silence then. And in that silence, Simon felt the weight he'd been carrying start to shift. His shoulders dropped, his heartbeat slowed, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about deadlines, clients, or how to stay relevant. He was just there, beside Adrian. It was almost midnight when Simon spoke again. You ever feel like this city's too much? Like it wants to swallow you whole? Adrian turned toward him, the wind brushing his hair. All the time. But that's why I stay. Because maybe someone else will need to see that it doesn't have to win. Simon didn't know what to say. So he didn't. He just looked at him, really looked, and something inside him gave way. Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was love. Whatever it was, it felt like rest. After that night, their lives tangled in quiet ways. Morning texts about the sunrise. Lunch breaks where Adrian would drop off small potted succulents with notes that read, "Don't forget to breathe." Late night walks along the East River, where Simon would talk and Adrian would listen until words didn't matter anymore. But love, even the gentle kind, is never simple. It was during one of those evenings when Simon's phone buzzed. A message from a design firm he'd dreamed of working for. They wanted him, full-time, in Los Angeles. A 6-figure salary, creative freedom, everything he'd once said he needed. Adrian noticed the change in his face immediately. Good news. Simon nodded slowly. Yeah, I think so. Adrian smiled, though his eyes dimmed slightly. That's amazing. You deserve it. I don't know, Simon murmured. It feels like if I go, I'll lose something I just found. Adrian didn't answer at first. He looked out over the city instead, the lights flickering across his face. Maybe, but sometimes rest isn't about staying still. Sometimes it's about knowing when to move. That night, Simon couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the hum of cars below, the endless pulse of the city, and realized how much it had changed, or maybe how much he had. The city still didn't sleep. But when he thought of Adrian, he did. Days passed. He avoided the topic, but it hung between them like heavy air. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun slanted across the shop windows, Adrian handed Simon a bouquet. Lavender, tulips, and a single white rose. What's this for? Simon asked. New beginnings, Adrian said. Whether here or somewhere else. Simon swallowed hard. You make it sound easy. Adrian met his eyes. It's not. But maybe that's what makes it worth it. Simon wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too small. So instead, he leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. Just quiet, warm, and real. When they pulled apart, Adrian's forehead rested against his. You'll do great things, he whispered. Simon closed his eyes. You already did. The morning Simon left for Los Angeles, the city was barely awake. He stood outside the flower shop, suitcase at his side, and watched Adrian sweeping the sidewalk. He didn't want to disturb him, but Adrian looked up anyway, like he had sensed him all along. They didn't need words. Simon just smiled, lifted the small pot of lavender in his hand, and nodded. Adrian's smile was the same, soft, unshakable, peaceful. As the taxi pulled away, Simon looked out the window and realized something. For the first time, the city wasn't screaming anymore. It was humming quietly, gently, like Adrian had that first night. And in that hum, Simon heard rest. The first few weeks in Los Angeles felt like walking through a dream he wasn't sure belonged to him. Everything was sleek, efficient, and perfectly curated. From the glass walls of the design studio to the polished smiles of people who moved like they were always late for something important. Simon tried to fit in, tried to let himself be swept up by the new rhythm. He posted sunrise photos, wore pressed shirts, and went to rooftop gatherings where people talked about art like it was currency. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the ocean air crept through his apartment window, it hit him. The silence didn't sound like peace anymore. It sounded like absence. He'd find himself scrolling back through old texts from Adrian, short messages about watering plants or taking time to breathe. They were simple words, yet they carried warmth in a way none of the compliments or contracts in Los Angeles ever could. He missed the smell of soil, the rustle of petals brushing against glass, the sound of Adrian humming off-key to old soul songs. He missed the stillness between them, that rare, unspoken calm that made the whole world feel lighter. One Sunday morning, while sipping his coffee on the balcony, he noticed the lavender pot Adrian had given him. The petals had started to fade, the soil dry and cracked. Simon frowned. He hadn't even realized how long it had been since he'd cared for it. He picked it up gently, running a thumb over the brittle stems. "You're supposed to help me breathe," he thought. "So why does it feel like I forgot how?" That was the moment something shifted. That afternoon, Simon left the city. He didn't pack much, just his camera, a notebook, and the dying lavender. He drove up the coast, not sure where he was heading, only knowing he needed to find quiet again. The road unfolded before him like a soft, steady breath. No deadlines, no screens, just miles of open sky. He stopped in a small seaside town 2 hours north, checked into a modest inn, and spent his evenings sitting by the beach with his sketchbook. He drew waves, cliffs, strangers walking hand in hand. The more he drew, the more he felt something returning. Not excitement, exactly, but a steadiness he hadn't known since New York. And in the middle of that stillness, his phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. "How's Ellie? The lavender holding up?" Simon stared at the text for a long time before replying. "It's different. The lavender's struggling. Maybe I am too." He hit send before he could second-guess it. Minutes passed. Then came Adrian's reply. "Maybe it needs new soil. Sometimes we all do." Simon smiled. He could almost hear Adrian saying it, voice low and gentle. He took the lavender outside, dug a small patch in the sand, and replanted it there. The wind blew salt into his hair, the sun warm on his skin. For the first time since leaving New York, he felt like he could breathe again. A week later, he returned to Los Angeles. Something inside him had changed. He worked slower, listened more, said no when projects felt hollow. People noticed. His art grew softer, more honest. He started incorporating organic textures, muted colors, spaces that breathed instead of screamed. When his boss asked what had inspired the shift, Simon simply said, "A flower shop in the East Village." Months passed. The firm sent him on a design tour in New York, and the moment he stepped off the plane, his chest tightened. Not with anxiety, but with recognition. The city still pulsed, but he was different now. He didn't rush. He didn't hide behind earbuds or screens. He walked slower, eyes open. On his last night there, he found himself standing outside Adrian's Blooms. The shop looked exactly the same, small, warm light spilling through the windows, petals pressed against glass. He hesitated before stepping inside. Adrian was behind the counter, arranging a bouquet of white lilies. He looked up, froze for a second, then smiled, that same quiet, knowing smile. "Simon." Simon laughed softly. "You remembered." "Of course I did." Adrian wiped his hands on his apron, leaning against the counter. "You look lighter. I guess I finally learned how to rest." Adrian tilted his head, that small, amused smile tugging at his lips. "And the lavender? It's alive again," Simon said. "Planted by the ocean." Something flickered in Adrian's eyes. Pride, maybe, or relief. "I always knew you'd keep it breathing." Simon looked around the shop, letting the scent of roses and eucalyptus wash over him. "This place feels smaller than I remember." "That's because you're not hiding from it anymore." Their eyes met. The air between them felt charged but calm, a heartbeat stretching out longer than it should. Simon exhaled. "I thought about calling. So many times." Adrian nodded. "But you didn't need to. Sometimes silence says everything." They stood there, letting the weight of the month settle. Then Adrian motioned toward the back door. "You want to see the roof again?" Simon followed him up the narrow stairs. When they reached the top, the city unfolded beneath them just as it had that summer night. Endless lights, restless hums, the sky glowing faintly orange. But this time, Simon didn't feel lost in it. He felt grounded. Adrian leaned against the railing. "You know, I never stopped believing you'd come back." Simon smiled. "I didn't either. I just didn't know when." They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching taxis move like fireflies below. The wind tangled their hair, the smell of rain lingering somewhere in the air. Simon turned slightly, studying the profile beside him, the man who had taught him to slow down, to breathe, to be. He spoke softly. You were right. Peace isn't a place. It's a choice. But it's easier to find when someone reminds you what it sounds like. Adrian's eyes met his, warm and steady. And what does it sound like now? Simon smiled. You. The city roared below them, yet neither moved. Simon reached out, fingers brushing Adrian's. This time, there was no hesitation, no rush. Just two people standing still in the middle of the noise, finding something that didn't need to be explained. For the first time in years, Simon felt entirely at home. He didn't know what came next, whether he'd stay, whether he'd return to LA, or whether their paths would twist again. But it didn't matter, because for once, the city that never slept finally felt like it could rest. And so could he. That night, Simon stayed with Adrian until the sky began to pale. They talked on the rooftop like they used to, about everything and nothing. About art, about loss, about the strange ache of finding home in a person instead of a place. The city below them slowly softened into morning light, and for the first time, Simon didn't dread the sunrise. He watched the way it touched Adrian's face, gold catching in his hair, eyes half-lidded with sleep. There was a serenity there that the city could never take away. I used to think this place would eat me alive, Simon said quietly. But it turns out it just needed me to slow down enough to listen. Adrian chuckled softly. The city doesn't need rest. People do. You were just smart enough to notice. Simon turned to him. You made me notice. Adrian met his gaze, and there it was again, the silence that had drawn them together. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full. When the sun was fully up, Adrian said, Come downstairs. I have something for you. Back in the shop, he pulled a small notebook from under the counter and handed it to Simon. Its cover was weathered, petals pressed between the pages. What's this? Simon asked. Something my dad used to keep. Notes about flowers, seasons, how to care for them. I've added my own over the years. Thought you might like it. Simon flipped through the pages. Inside were sketches, gentle handwriting, and little messages tucked between the notes. Don't forget to water yourself too. Every root grows toward light, even in concrete. He closed the notebook, holding it close. Adrian, Don't say anything, Adrian interrupted softly. Just take it. Wherever you go next, let something living come with you. Simon nodded, unable to find words that felt big enough. Over the next few days, he visited the shop every evening after work. He helped Adrian stack boxes, sweep petals from the floor, wrap bouquets for customers who never seemed to look up from their phones. They didn't need to talk much anymore. Being there was enough. One evening, as Simon was leaving, Adrian called out, You're not leaving for good again, are you? Simon paused at the door, smiling. Not this time. He meant it. Weeks melted into months. The design tour ended, but Simon decided not to go back to Los Angeles right away. He found freelance clients who didn't mind time zones, and he rented a small apartment 2 blocks away from the shop. On weekends, he painted in the back corner of Adrian's store while customers browsed. His art changed again. More color, more softness, less control. People began noticing. One of his pieces, a digital painting of lavender blooming from cracked concrete, went viral online with the caption, Rest is an act of rebellion. It became a quiet movement. Artists, students, burned-out professionals began sharing it, adding their own stories about finding peace in chaos. When a reporter reached out to ask what had inspired it, Simon hesitated, then said, A man who grows flowers in the loudest city on earth. Adrian laughed when he read the interview. You make me sound like some kind of saint. Simon grinned. You're worse than a saint. You're patient. They started seeing each other outside the shop, late-night dinners, long walks through Central Park, Sunday mornings at small markets. They didn't define it. They didn't need to. Their bond wasn't about labels. It was about presence. One evening in early winter, snow began to fall as they locked up the shop. Adrian stepped outside, tilted his head back, and let the flakes land on his lashes. "I always forget how quiet snow makes everything," he said. Simon watched him, heart swelling. "It's the only time the city actually rests." Adrian turned toward him, smiling. "And you love it, don't you?" "I do." Simon reached out, brushing snow from his coat. "I love it because it feels like you." Adrian's breath caught. He stepped closer until there was barely space between them. "Say that again." Simon smiled faintly. "You heard me." They kissed then, slow, sure, like they were both finally ready to stop running. The world around them disappeared. There was no noise, no rush, just warmth and falling snow. When they pulled apart, Adrian laughed softly, voice trembling with emotion. "You always find peace in the strangest places, Simon. Maybe because you're always there when I do." From that moment on, the noise of New York no longer felt like a threat. Felt like rhythm, messy, alive, real. Over the following months, life didn't turn perfect, but it became honest. Adrian's shop flourished, thanks in part to a small feature in an online magazine that quoted Simon's artwork. Business grew. People started visiting Adrian's blooms not just for flowers, but to breathe for a moment. They said the shop felt different, like time slowed down inside. Sometimes Simon would sit by the window sketching, and strangers would ask if he was the artist who made that viral lavender piece. He'd nod, smile, and point to Adrian. "He's the real artist here." And every time he said it, Adrian would shake his head, smiling quietly to himself. One spring morning, nearly a year after Simon's return, they were sitting on the rooftop again. The lavender pot, now lush and full, rested between them. Adrian poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and handed one to Simon. "You ever think about what's next?" Adrian asked. Simon took a sip, gazing out at the skyline. "All the time, but for the first time, I'm not in a hurry to find out." Adrian nodded slowly. "Good, because I was thinking, maybe we could open another shop, somewhere quieter, by the ocean, maybe." Simon looked at him, startled. "You'd leave New York?" Adrian smiled faintly. "I'd follow peace, wherever it grows." For a moment, Simon couldn't speak. The idea of leaving the city that had both broken and rebuilt him felt unreal, but the thought of doing it with Adrian made sense in a way nothing else ever had. He reached across the small table, fingers brushing Adrian's. "Then maybe it's time." They sat there, hands intertwined, the city humming softly beneath them. The skyline shimmered in the morning light, alive and endless. Yet for them, the world had narrowed to something simple. Peace, connection, rest. Simon realized then that Adrian hadn't just made him believe in rest again. He'd made him believe in belonging, in choosing softness in a world that glorified speed. A few months later, they packed up the shop. They left the city quietly, no grand announcements, no farewells. Just 2 men, a van full of plants, and a lavender pot on the dashboard. As they crossed the bridge out of Manhattan, Simon looked back once. The skyline glowed behind them, and for the first time he didn't feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was bringing something with him. Adrian reached over, lacing their fingers together. "You ready?" Simon smiled. "For once, I am." They drove until the skyscrapers faded into cliffs, until the air turned to salt and wind. When they stopped, it was in a small coastal town where the waves sounded like laughter and the stars came out early. They opened a new shop there, a quiet place called the Still Bloom. And every morning, before opening the doors, Simon watered the lavender. The city that never slept was far behind them, but its lesson remained. Sometimes the loudest places teach you the value of quiet. Sometimes chaos shows you where peace begins. And sometimes, in the most restless city in the world, you meet someone who teaches you how to rest and how to love again. Simon looked at Adrian one morning as sunlight spilled across the counter. Adrian turned, that familiar smile curving his lips, And in that moment Simon knew, this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one they would finally live slowly. The sound of the waves had become the rhythm of their days. Every morning, before the world fully woke, Simon would stand by the open window of their small coastal home and breathe in the salt air. It was quieter here. No sirens, no honking, no endless chatter spilling from crowded sidewalks. Just the sea, the wind, and the slow hum of life moving at its own pace. It had been 6 months since they'd opened the Still Bloom. The locals had welcomed them with an ease Simon hadn't expected. Fishermen stopped by for sunflowers to bring home to their wives. Children pressed their faces against the glass to watch Adrian make floral crowns. And every weekend, a small crowd would gather outside the shop just to smell the lavender that lined the entrance. Simon handled the art side, painting signs, designing cards, managing their small website. Adrian tended to the plants, as he always had, his hands steady, movements deliberate. They worked like two halves of something that had been searching for itself for years. But peace, Simon learned, wasn't the same as perfection. Some nights, when the ocean wind turned sharp and the candles flickered low, Simon would wake to find Adrian sitting on the porch, staring at the sea. His face would be unreadable, calm, yes, but distant in a way that made Simon's heart ache. One night Simon joined him. The moon hung low over the water, silver light rippling across the waves. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. Adrian smiled faintly without looking at him. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange it is," Adrian murmured. "We spend half our lives chasing something. Peace, happiness, love. And when we finally find it, part of us doesn't know what to do with it." Simon studied him for a long moment. "Do you feel lost?" Adrian shook his head slowly. "No, just still. And sometimes stillness feels like standing on a cliff. You love the view, but you can't forget how easy it would be to fall." Simon reached over, placing a hand on his. "Then maybe we just learn to stand together." Adrian turned to him then, eyes softening. "You always make it sound so simple." "It's not," Simon said, squeezing gently. "But it's worth trying." They sat in silence after that, the waves whispering their endless lullaby. The next morning, the Still Bloom was busier than usual. A travel blogger had written about them, calling their shop a hidden piece of calm on the wild coast. Orders came in from nearby towns, and tourists began stopping by with cameras and notebooks. Simon watched Adrian move through the rush with quiet grace, but by the end of the day, he noticed the tired slump in his shoulders. When they finally locked up, Adrian sighed and leaned against the counter. "I wanted peace," he said with a small laugh. "And somehow we made it popular." Simon chuckled. "We could always hang a sign, closed for breathing." Adrian's eyes sparkled with amusement. "You might be onto something." But that night, Simon lay awake, thinking. He realized that even paradise could start to hum with the same kind of noise they tried to escape. And if they weren't careful, the rhythm of the world could drown out their own again. Weeks passed. The shop grew, the attention spread, and soon the Still Bloom was featured in a small lifestyle magazine. They were invited to a garden exhibition in the city, a chance to showcase Adrian's floral designs. Simon hesitated when the letter arrived. The idea of returning to the noise they had left behind made something inside him tighten. But Adrian looked at him with that steady gaze and said, "Maybe it's time we go back, not to escape, but to show what we've learned." So they went. The exhibition was held in a renovated warehouse by the harbor.